What's up, my good peoples? Welcome to the Be Transformed podcast, where we're talking about ideas that stimulate wholesome thinking into identity, purpose, vision, and action. I am James Anderson. With me is Logan Eaton, and my good peoples, please welcome, get your hands ready to welcome Carolyn Anderson, my wife.
Oh, hello, people.
Yeah, welcome to be here.
Oh, I am welcome to be here. Yes.
Me too.
Kids are in bed, and I get to be a part of this tonight. Positive trade-off.
Yeah, absolutely.
A lot of good information. Look at all this stuff.
Look at all that stuff.
Official.
Yeah. So tonight we're talking about, well, we're taking a different look at what Paul was talking about boasting in his weakness. Yeah, I was recently just thinking about this concept, so essentially in 2 Corinthians something, Paul talks about how he gets this thorn in his flesh, this messenger of Satan to torment him, to keep him from being proud, because he had these like crazy revelations. And so he says 3 times he asked God to take it away. And each time God said, my strength is sufficient because, what he said, my grace is sufficient because my strength is made perfect in weakness. And, I was thinking about this, and it just got me interested in the context around all of this. So I looked it up, and here's the kind of skinny. So I think that happens in like chapter 12. But so in 2 Corinthians chapters 10 through 13, you have Paul defending his apostleship. So there was these false apostles that came into the company of the Corinthians, and they started saying all kinds of weird crap, talking about, here's Paul's account ish in 2 Corinthians 11. He kind of talks a little bit about what these people are doing. He says, because there becomes this whole battle about boasting, because these guys are saying all these high and lofty things about who they are, why they came from God, and why these people should listen to them, give them all their stuff, give them all their money, right? These guys are just totally taking advantage of them and having this influence over them. But Paul's like, dude, these guys are freaking stealing from you. And so he gets into this thing where he talks about, which I think most people are familiar with. He gets into that whole concept of like, these people say they're Hebrews, well, so am I. They say they're Israelites, well, so am I, right? And so this all happens because these people were trying to take over the authority of these Corinthians. And so the whole thing's really interesting, and to get the whole context, it's chapter 10 through 13 in 2 Corinthians. But one of the things Paul says, he's like, and since others boast about their human achievements, I will too. After all, you think you're wise, but you enjoy putting up with fools. You put up with it when someone enslaves you, takes everything you have, takes advantage of you, takes control of everything, and slaps you in the face. I'm ashamed to say that we have been too weak to do that. Right? And then he goes on, and he says, just talking about their boasting, he's like, oh, and don't worry, we wouldn't dare to say that we are as wonderful as these other men who tell you how important they are, but they are only comparing themselves with each other, using themselves as the standard of measurement. How ignorant. Right? And it's just this, Paul's just kind of breaking down. It's like, these guys are not from God. It's like they're talking about a gospel that's different than the one we preach. You're talking about a Jesus that's different than what we preach. You're talking about a spirit that's different than what we preach. It's like, man, you guys need to, like, you kind of need to wake up. Like, we are who we say we are. Like, don't forget what we did. And so, yeah, it's interesting just because all of this context kind of flows out into that main idea of I boast in my weakness. So there's these apostles boasting about their quote unquote achievements and strength. And then Paul starts to kind of share what proves that he's an apostle, like his deeds that he's done. So in 2 Corinthians 11, verse 21 through 27, Paul says, "But whatever they dare to boast about," he's like, "I'm talking like a fool again. I dare to boast about too. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I know I sound like a madman, but I have served him far more. I have worked harder, been put in prison more often, been whipped times without number, and faced death again and again. 5 different times the Jewish leaders gave me 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. Once I spent a whole night and day adrift at sea. I have traveled on many long journeys. I have faced dangers in the rivers and from robbers. I have faced danger from my own people, the Jews, as well as from the Gentiles. I have faced dangers in the cities, in the deserts, and on the seas. I have faced dangers from men who claim to be believers but are not. I have worked hard and long, enduring many sleepless nights. I have been hungry and thirsty, and have often gone without food. I have shivered in the cold without enough comfort to keep warm. Then, besides all this, I have the daily burden of my concern for all the churches. Who is weak without me feeling that weakness? Who is led astray and I don't burn with anger? If I must boast, I would rather boast about the things that show how weak I am. God, the Father of our Lord Jesus, who is worthy of eternal praise, knows I am not lying. When I was in Damascus, the governor under King Aretas, say that 10 times, kept guards at the city gates to catch me. I had to be lowered in a basket through a window in the city wall to escape him. So, Paul's talking about these things he encountered by following God. And it's like these things that he suffered, like, proves, one, that he came from God. Because you can't fake it when you're being beaten multiple times, right? Not just like one time, not one instance, but multiple times. It's one thing to accidentally get beaten. It's another thing to like wake up in the morning and do it again, do the same things that got you beaten the last time. And so, but it's interesting. He's like, nah, but I'd rather boast about the things that show that I'm weak. But that was in regards to like his daily burden of his concern for all the churches. He's like, who's weak and I don't feel that weakness? Who's led astray and I don't burn with anger, right? Like his compassion, care, and need for these people, I think, was quote unquote weakness compared to like what the quote unquote super apostles, what the strength they were boasting about, right? Compared to what they were talking about. This looks like weakness, like Paul's actual care and concern for people instead of manipulating them and taking advantage of them. And so then Paul goes on and he says, this is where it kind of gets a little crazy in chapter 12. So Paul talks about, he's like, well, then I could go on to boast about these visions and revelations that I've had, right? And he's like, there's this one time about 14 years ago, right? In the body or out of the body, I don't know. But I went to the third heaven in paradise and saw things so astounding that they cannot be expressed in words, things no human is allowed to tell. And he says that experience is worth boasting about, but I'm not going to do it. Can you say bummer? He says, I will boast only about my weakness. If I wanted to boast, I would be no fool in doing so because I would be telling the truth. But I won't do it, because I don't want anyone to give me credit beyond what they can see in my life or hear in my message, even though I have received such wonderful revelations from God. Right? So these false apostles were like, no, man, look, here's all the great things we've done. Here's our resume. Here's how amazing we are. Paul's like, no, man, look, man, I get beat. I get led down a basket because these people are trying to kill me. He's like, no, I focus on these things. I don't focus on these revelations because he's like, you could hear He could tell you the story about how he encountered God and literally saw the invisible kingdom and things that there aren't even words to display and express what he saw. He could talk about those things, and then your perspective of him, man, would skyrocket, right? You'd be like, this guy, it's amazing. He's got, this favor of God, and you could worship him for that. But he's like, look, I'm not even going to talk about that because I don't want you to look at me in a way that I don't actually demonstrate in my life, right? The view you should have of me is based off of my message and my conduct. This is just a totally different perspective than those false apostles. All right, so then here's where it gets real weird. So Paul, he's talking about he had these, so he's had these epic and wonderful revelations. So Paul says, so to keep me from becoming proud, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me and keep me from being proud. All right, that's kind of weird. So then 3 times, this is Paul talking, 3 times I begged the Lord to take it away. Each time he said, my grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. So now I am glad to boast about my weakness, so that the power of Christ can work through me. That's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses and in the insults, the hardships, the persecutions, and troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. But it seems like Paul's perspective of weakness might be different than maybe what we typically think of weakness. What do you guys think about that? Or any of that?
Yeah, I'm trying to just ask myself questions, trying to go through this. Like what? So if we're trying to figure out what really the weakness was, or what was strength, like what was the strength that it's compared to? Like what is it? What is the weakness that we're looking about? What is it compared? What's the opposite of it? The strength that was supposedly on these other Pharisees. Like if strength is like if strength that in this circumstance was pride and arrogance and lying and trying to trick people, then I would want to boast in weaknesses too. I would want to boast in the delivering the truth in the purest form possible, and not telling them about the visions that I had just for the sake of not wanting somebody to look to get the truth in an unpure form. So if strength is this pride, arrogance, and trickery, then I think Paul's right on when he's saying like, yeah, I'm going to boast in my weaknesses. I'm going to give the truth in the purest form, and I'm going to boast about the opposite of whatever these false Pharisees were boasting about, which was like the pride and the arrogance, the trickery, the lying to get to exploit people and gain from them. So if that's the strength, then the weakness is definitely not what we think about weakness today. The weakness that Paul's talking about is definitely not what we think about being weak, or the weaknesses that we think about today. Because weaknesses today is like, I think it's like a bunch of, it's probably more like the first thing you think about is the physical or the mental weaknesses, the victim mindset. And I don't think that's what Paul's talking about here. If the strengths that he was comparing to was pride, arrogance, trickery, exploitation, and all that. So that's just what I guess was thinking about going through that. It's like we're not even talking about weaknesses. Just seems like to me has a different connotation in these verses than what we would think about weakness today. But
yeah.
I think weakness often can come across as an inability to do something, whereas here he's clearly doing something, which is why he's having hardships, persecutions. And so his weakness is showing that he's actually going through this stuff, where the super apostles were just boasting about what they were doing, but they weren't going through any hardships. So when he's saying, I take pleasure in my weaknesses, it's because Christ is shown, the power of Christ is shown through through those weaknesses, but those weaknesses are the hardships and the troubles. And in order to, someone who's weak, couldn't
actions
go
he's
through
taking?
something. Yeah, those actions. You can't be weak and go through something like that over and over and over. He's clearly strong, but Christ is shown as strong through that because of what he's going through.
So it's definitely not an inability. He's definitely saying it's not this inability that he has, because it's obviously that he has the ability because he's doing these things.
Yeah, I think sometimes we think, like, I'm just a weak human. I don't have any ability. I don't have any skills. Only Christ in me shows that. But really, we are God's creation. So
Yeah.
we aren't just nothings.
Yeah,
We have skill and ability, and
Yeah.
obviously Paul had lots of ability in order to go through these hardships, to be sharing with people and to be out there day after day, and had the motivation to do it.
Yeah, in my experience, believing that you have an inability is just an excuse. I know I've used it as an excuse not to do something or not to take on responsibility or accountability.
Yeah.
And I guess that's definitely not the case with what Paul's doing here. He's definitely taking responsibility for the people and for his own life and for the message of delivering pure truth. And he's definitely putting in the effort to do that. So, thinking that weakness is an inability can mask itself in just an excuse to not do something, an excuse to not take a step, or an excuse to not put forth effort or take responsibility for something. And I know I've done that. I've been in that state of mind where it's like subconsciously I'm thinking like, yeah, I have no ability to do this. And it's just, it feels better. It's like, yeah, I don't even have to think about it anymore, even though I know deeper down that I should be doing this. I should be doing something.
Yeah.
Or taking a step or something.
So how'd you get off the hook? So because of the inability, so you're supposed to do something, but you're like, no, I'm too scared. So it's like, okay, well,
yeah,
like somehow, how does that excuse you? Like in that mindset, like how does
it excuse?
It's like, I can't do it. Well, I'll just give it to God. Because you're in like this kind of maybe confusion, emotional turmoil.
Well, you don't
like, well, I just got to give it to God.
Right. When you say that to yourself, or you say that, it's like the responsibility is no longer on you anymore. It takes that. It's just this a way to make yourself feel better, that it's like, okay, I don't even have to worry about this anymore.
Yeah.
I think, like we talked about before we started, just even the word surrender, where like in that moment of inability, you could say, okay, I surrender all this, but that doesn't mean backing off from your responsibility. And that surrender actually being like owning it.
Yeah, you don't.
But
right, you don't want to give something to God that He wants to give back to you.
That gave to you, yeah.
But He's trying to give to you, like at the same time.
Yeah, but surrenders. That one gets weird because where it's a real thing, it's different than you would think. Because so like let's just say like you feel like you should be doing something, but then you're scared and now you're conflicted on the inside. You're like, yeah. Like you don't want to embrace it anymore because it like terrifies you. So because it terrifies you, there's that idea of like, okay, well maybe I shouldn't do it. But then you've got this conflict. Well then, you could get that idea or that advice like, well, you just need to surrender to God. So it's like, okay, because I'm in this emotional turmoil, it's because I'm not surrendering. So I just need to give that to Him and then I'll be okay. But it's like, no, you really just need to like do the thing you're supposed to do and embrace the fear. But yeah, that concept of surrender kind of turns into this, I'm not going to do anything until I clearly hear from God. Like He's going to have to move this table an inch before I know that God wants me to do this. Right. And but that becomes back into like the slave mentality where Jesus is like, no, bro, like you guys, I no longer call you servants. I call you friends. Right. And then once you become born again, you become children, right, with a father. And a father's mentality is to, let me teach you how to be like me. So,
yeah, I was just had thought like surrender's giving you an excuse to live in indecision then, just to live in a state of indecision.
In the incorrect version of surrender, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think you can misinterpret or not even understand what that actually means to say, I'm giving it to God. So
Right.
a lot of times I think we can say that, like, oh, I'm just going to give it to God. But it's like, what does that actually look like? What does that actually mean? And when
And
you
why?
can think about it as like taking action while in union with Christ, like figuring out, where he's taking you, what you're supposed to be doing. But it's not just like the sit back and wait for answers, but it's taking steps in faith and in action. Because that's totally different. I mean, it seems like it would be easy to give it to God, but then what does that actually mean or look like?
Well, that's just like a misunderstanding of who we are and who God is, right? Like, we have duties and responsibilities on purpose. I mean, Jesus came, brought restoration, and then left, right? I mean, like, and he says, okay, I'm going to go away for a long time, like a really long time. Well, then I'm going to come back, and then you guys are going to give an account of what you did, right? It's like he gave, in these different parables, he gave them money. They gave them his estate. And he's like, all right, I'm going to leave. He's like, you're going to increase this. I'm going to leave. I'm not going to check in on you, right? In this parable, right? I was like, the accountability and the reckoning is when I come back. Then we're going to make an account. And that's then what you're rewarded or punished for. So, yeah, this concept of the, whatever, Jesus take the wheel. It's like, no, I think you get the wheel back in Jesus, right? And then you get coordinates to where you should go. And like the power that fuels that car is called the Holy Spirit. And you drive.
Yeah.
God's not interested in making anybody do anything, right? The reason why there was 2 trees in the garden is because it's not a choice if there's no options, right? God's not interested in making anybody do anything. If he was, we would not be so ignorant of who he is and who we are. That just wouldn't be a real thing. If God was in control and controlled everything, we would not be so confused about who God is.
Yeah.
So then it matters then what we do, like the decisions we make.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Like sometimes people are like, well, I don't know, man. It's just like people say, well, you just need to, I don't know, confess your weakness to God. No. Jesus said, why would you doubt? Like the disciples are in a boat. Jesus is asleep. This storm is raging. The waters, there's wind, there's waves, there's waters piling into the boat. The disciples are freaking out. They wake up Jesus, but bro, don't you care? We're about to die. Jesus is like, shh. And the storm calms down. And he's like, why would you doubt? I think we're like, no, you got to give it. No, he's like, why would you doubt? He's like, yeah, but it's so. No. He's like, where is your faith? He's like, when the Son of Man comes back to earth, will there be faith? And it's like, sometimes there's just this weird concept of, it's like, there's just this weird cycle that I wish we could explain better in the moment. But it's like, there's this thing where people are like, okay, you can't do anything without God. But then when we have God, we're still saying you really can't do anything either. Because we keep coming back to this inability and thinking somehow that's all we have and that's what we're stuck with.
Well, it's almost the separation where like that doesn't, once you're in God, you're in God. So it's not this like, I'm apart from God, I can do nothing. Oh wait, now I've got him, I can do something. But it's like, instead, there isn't a separation. We're in God, so we can do it,
Yeah.
Another experience I've had is that confessing your inability brings about like an emotional state, and then that brings about this perception of connection to God, and so then you go through that, and then you might go about different things, but then you feel distant from God, and you wonder why you feel distant from God. It's because you don't have that connection, and you think, well, what brought about that connection? It was that emotional state that happened when I was confessing all my inability and all this stuff. And so you go back into that, and you just reinforce the idea that you don't have any ability, and you're too weak to do anything, or you're not good enough to do anything, and then you get that emotional feeling that brings about a connection, and then you feel close, and then you go, and it just starts that cycle. That's my experience that I've had. It's like, and then when you feel confident and you feel like you're going somewhere, it's like, why do I feel distant from God?
Yeah. And
but the beautiful part is like you gotta bridge like you gotta take that in that part where you're confident, you're going somewhere, you're doing something, and it's like that's when you're moving and God's working, and not in this false perception of a connection brought about by just a human emotion.
Yeah. That's then where you need to. That's then where it's time to have faith, right? Because it's like okay, now I'm taking action, but then it feels like I'm far away from God. So does that mean I'm going in the wrong direction, right? Dude, I think about that all the time, and I'm like, no, this is where you employ faith. This is where I'm gonna believe and keep going. No, but I'm not having these, and I'm like, I don't know. I'm not like hearing all these things. No, this is where you have faith. You remember where you're going, and you keep going.
Yeah.
Well, it's like those obstacles. It's like Paul certainly didn't doubt that he was going the right way, and he certainly faced plenty of obstacles to challenge.
Yeah, when his boat wrecked 3 times, I think, it's like, am I going the? At some point, you're like, am I going the right way?
Oh, his journeys were gnarly. I mean, you didn't have you're not on a cruise ship, man. You're on a freaking sailboat, right? I mean,
a wooden one.
Yeah.
Like
with oars, maybe. I don't know.
A polyester one or a plastic one.
There ain't no slide on the top of that bad boy.
Once I spent a whole night and day adrift at sea. It wasn't just shipwreck.
Yeah.
That's what it feels like though. Sometimes when you're moving, when you're going in a direction, it's like you feel like you're floating around, but you got to keep going towards the destination.
Yeah.
And trust. Yeah, that's faith. It's trusting that you're moving towards the destination.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking about kind of just what you were talking about. I mean, one, it's like you get into that cycle and you start creating a habit of like inability. Like that becomes your identity.
You start to believe it. Yeah.
But there was a podcast by Chris Valentin, and he was talking about how the difference between like forgiveness and repentance. And he's like, you can kind of get addicted to forgiveness because it's like, asking for forgiveness or confessing, your inabilities or this and that. You can there can be a weight that's lifted, but then you can get that weight lifted, but then never actually repent, right? So repent means to change the way you think. So it's like we're talking about getting out of the inability and into ability, which is just a process of taking action. There was something else, Chris. I was listening to a podcast today, and he was talking about he had this encounter with Jesus. He was in the bathtub reading or praying or whatever. Jesus walks through the wall and like just starts talking to him. I'm gonna start hanging out in the bathtub, I guess.
Yeah.
But so Jesus tells him, he's like, hey man, you're gonna be a prophet to the nations. You're gonna impact governments and all these things. And he's like, the encounter lasted like a half hour. And then he said Jesus was walking out of the room and then all of a sudden stopped, turned around, came right up to him, looked him in the face. And I'm going to get this wrong. But he looked at him and Chris could see like the world was in his eyes. And Jesus said, history will prove whether or not you believe me. Like history, what you do will affect change, or what you don't do won't affect change. And the world, when you're gone, when you're dead, history will prove whether or not you believe me or not. And it's just like, son of a, like,
wow,
believe. Yeah.
Yeah. But when Jesus is talking to you right in the face, telling that history will prove whether you believed or not, it's like there's no such thing as inability anymore.
No, there's just take action.
Yeah.
Take action. Well, because it's like you look at Paul's resume, man. It's just like, we got to do something with their lives. He's like, look. He says, are they servants of Christ? He says, I've served him far more. Like he's like, I've worked harder, been put in prison more often, been whipped times without number, faced death again and again. 5 different times the Jewish leaders gave me 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. Once I spent a whole night and day adrift at sea. I've traveled on many long journeys. I faced dangers from rivers and from robbers. I faced danger from my own people, the Jews, as well as from the Gentiles. I faced danger in the cities, in the deserts, and on the seas. And I faced dangers from men who claim to be believers but are not. I have worked hard and long, enduring many sleepless nights. I have been hungry and thirsty and have often gone without food. I've shivered in the cold without enough clothing to keep me warm. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. He didn't even talk about like wild beasts and all this other crap. I mean, this is like, we got to freaking do something with our lives, man. I mean, history will prove whether or not you believe me. Shit. That's legit. Yeah. My gosh. Yeah, so kind of going back to Paul just for a second. Paul, so he was talking about this thorn in his flesh, right? So that he wouldn't become proud. This is just interesting, right? Because this all has to do with like when he says, I'm going to boast in my weakness, because in my weakness his strength is made perfect. So this is in relations to like this thorn in his flesh. But here's what's interesting. Let's just clarify this real quick. Paul was given a thorn in his flesh. Paul was. Like, not me, not you, hopefully not you that's listening, right? Like, you weren't given a thorn in your flesh. Paul was. Yeah. And it says, but this thorn was given to him not because of what he didn't know, right? So, I mean, when you think about this weakness, you're like, are we talking about our inabilities? I don't think so. Because look, he's not talking about, he didn't get this thorn because of what he didn't have or what he didn't experience or what he didn't understand. It was given to him because of what he knew, because of what he had seen, because of what he had experienced. He was given the thorn because of his overflowing abundance of encounters, not the lack thereof, which is super interesting. It's like this thing came because of like everything epic that he had, but like I don't know, he still needed to keep his mind in check. I don't totally get it, but what I see in the context of this, it's something different than just our inabilities. It's like it's more like obedience unto death. Yeah, 2 Corinthians starts out in chapter 1. If I can find it real quick. Give me a second. Oh yeah. So in 2 Corinthians 1, verse 8 and some, it says, we think you ought to know, dear brothers and sisters, about the trouble we went through in the province of Asia. We were crushed and overwhelmed beyond our ability to endure. And we thought we would never live through it. In fact, we expected to die. But as the result, we stopped relying on ourselves and learned to rely only on God, who raises the dead. And he did rescue us from mortal danger and will rescue us again. Right? Like, this weakness, I don't know, like, so in this, right? Like, they literally thought they were going to die, like, because people are actually trying to kill them. So they were like, man, they just, I don't know, when you're like, death is imminent, that's kind of rough, right? Like, it was like beyond what they could bear. But it caused them to stop relying on them and learn to rely on God, who raises the dead. I mean, we're talking about like literally like they're facing death. So this reality of like the resurrection and just the manifestation of the kingdom of heaven, which is invisible. I mean, it's like whether you believe that or not is really going to be crystal clear when you're actually facing death because of it. And so he's talking about this thing. He's like, all right, man, we got off ourselves and got into Jesus. It's like this weakness, everything this weakness is circled around is epic action, because this whole thing, he's like, I'm going to boast in my, he's like, because what he said. Yeah, he says, so now I'm glad to boast about my weakness so that the power of Christ can work in through me. That's why I pleasure, but look at this lineup, right? That's why I pleasure in my weaknesses and in the insults, hardships, persecutions, and troubles that I suffer for Christ. Because when I'm weak, I'm strong. Like everything is talking about action. Everything is talking about perseverance. Everything is talking about persecutions and insults and hardships. It's all talking about like moving. None of it's talking about like, I've got this problem. I don't understand. I'm not well trained. It's like, that's just not what any of this is wrapped around. I mean, you even think about that, that passage talks about contentment, right? He's like, I know what it's like to be in need. I know what it's like to have plenty. I know what it's like to be hungry, to be well fed, have clothes, not clothes, But I've learned to be content in every situation because I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Like, a lot of times that just gets boiled down to, hey, you just need to be happy with what you have. No, Paul's like, I don't freaking care what I have or don't have. I'm going to freaking dominate. Like, I'm going to spread this message so that every Gentile that is on earth will have heard the name Jesus. Like, that's what everything is wrapped around. None of it's wrapped around inability.
Well, that's where it's like in the obstacles, you're showing the strength because you're still doing it. Like, doesn't matter if I don't have clothes or I don't have food. He's still going. And so instead of the contentment piece where it's like, it doesn't matter what you have, you should be content. It's more of the like doing what I'm supposed to be doing, no matter the obstacles. The obstacles don't prove that you're not going the right way. They just are part of the journey.
It's being being content during the action. It's not a verse that justifies being content in this indecision state. It's like being content in the action where you're facing obstacles in all those situations, because all those situations he's talking about came from him taking actions. And so it's not a verse that justifies being content just in sitting in indecision and justifying indecision as or using that verse as an excuse for indecision and just the inability to make a decision. I guess that's what I thought, and what Carolyn said was like, it's being content on the moving parts. When you're moving and all these things are coming at you and you're in different situations, it's not being content in doing nothing. That's kind of what I thought. Yeah, because I've used that verse as an excuse to just be content in not making a decision.
Oh, I got just be happy with life. Do nothing. Be happy existing.
Yeah.
No, man. I don't know. I can't. No.
Yeah. Eventually you won't. Eventually you might feel good for a second, but eventually you're gonna go insane because, especially if there's just something inside that you need to be doing, or there's something that needs done. You'll go crazy.
Yeah,
because we're not designed that way. We just weren't built that way.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting, man. It is interesting. It's interesting to think what we could do. Like it's interesting to think if we just decided that we wanted to like impact Bowling Green. Like if we just decided like this is what we're going to do. Like we're going to get into the schools. We're going to get into these businesses. We're going to get into the, the government here. And it's like, we're just, the goal is to make an impact. Let's serve and let's see how we can help out and see, what are problems that we can bring the solution to. I mean, if we just decided like we're actually going to be the light of the world, it's like, in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, would history prove, right, that the light of the world got out of the bucket and actually shined and actually gave light to the places that needed it? It's just interesting to think about the potential. I think about that sometimes. I just like, if I wasn't, I'm slowly taking action, but it's like, dude, I'm scared. There's things I'm scared of. I had a meeting last night, pumped up to go to it. Afterwards, they're like, yeah, let's do it. And I'm like, I'm like scared. I was like, it's hard to commit, but it's like, if I didn't care about being scared, and just, I didn't care about like working it out, bombing and showing up again. Like if I didn't care about, or if I just who cares, and just got into it, like how much could I actually accomplish? What could I actually do? If I blew up my TV, it's just like and just like, what if all my time, it's just like, what if I gave my entire self to it? Like, what could I actually get done?
Yeah.
Well, that comes back around to the boasting in your weakness. If you go do it and it bombs, but then you do it again, and then, it's like you did it. And so you can't become strong if you don't push through when it doesn't go well.
That's
Yeah.
really true.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, you can't know what strong and weak is unless you're moving, unless you're doing something.
Yeah.
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 And you're gonna run into obstacles.
Yeah.
And when you look back in 20 years, if you never did the first one, how can 20 years from now be better than the first one if you
Yeah.
didn't do the first one?
Right.
That won't be as good, But you did it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he said, I boast in my weaknesses because then I am strong. Right? I mean, the whole thing about contentment is that, no, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. But like for reals, I wish I could say it in a different way to take like the religious emptiness out of it. But it's like, no, seriously, like I keep going because there's this thing that it's like, it's beyond, it's beyond the care for my body. It's not that I don't like my body. It's just that like I care about achieving the kingdom in spite of it.
No matter what.
Yeah. Which, I mean, that's intense, man. You got to think about Paul's body. I mean, you saw him with his shirt off. Dude would have been, it would have just been scar tissue from all these beatings.
Yeah. He was obsessed. He was obsessed about what he had to get done.
Yeah. And who is it? It's Peter, right? He's like, he's saying, I think this first part was from him. He's talking about, he's like, you haven't yet suffered to the point of shedding blood, and like your resistance against sin in the world. He says, but people who suffer like physically for Jesus, they're done with sin. It's just like, it's over. It's like you don't live your life anymore for worldly pleasures, but only to serve Christ. Go out there and get a beat down. But not because you're dumb, not because of being dumb. I don't think that works that way. But no, man, I just think this whole thing just speaks of, man, let's do something, man. Let history speak that we freaking believe, and let whatever that is in our weaknesses, man, whatever, who cares? Regardless, let Christ be found strong. When you look at our lives, when people on the outside, inside, look at our lives, be like, bro, all I can see is Jesus. It's sexy. Let that be your life. My good peoples, until next time, peace. Guys, thanks so much for sticking around. If you're new to Be Transformed, make sure you subscribe and then hit us up at teambetransformed.com, where you can find everything you need to live a life that says all day, I keep it cultivated. If you're not sure what that is, make sure you check out the video and then join the movement. Until next time, peace.